Anyways, without wasting much of your time, our opening gambit works after white plays pawn to d4 on the first move. You just play knight to c6, inviting white to advance his d pawn to d5. And this is the area of our meat in this video, but I'm still going to show you what to do if white plays other moves such as knight f3 and pawn to c4. So, in over the board games, what you will see most of your opponents playing is pawn to d5. There is actually nothing wrong with pawn to d5, simply attacking the knight. Here we'll just play knight e5, and then when you look into the Lichess database, even in the Masters database, pawn to e4 is by far the most played move, after which we play pawn to e6. And again, when you look into the Lichess database or the Masters database, pawn to f4 harassing the knight is by far the most played move. Now this is called the Mikenas defense. Please, I want you to memorize this opening as I show you where the inventor of this opening got this idea from. A minute please. If you watched my previous video on the Alliance defense, which has obviously popped up in the card above, pawn to e4, knight f6, pawn to e5, knight d4. And again, I saw most of your comments, guys. Here you were saying most of your opponents play pawn to c4. They no longer play pawn to d4. I'm sorry, but I do not really concur with what you said, because when you check the Lichess database here, and you can even see for yourselves, pawn to d4 is the most played move even at the top level, because these are games played by real masters, real people. There is nothing wrong with pawn to c4. Anyway, so after pawn to d4, the main move here is pawn to d6 by black, after which white plays pawn to c4. Now hold on, have you seen these three pawns right here? See this structure here and the pawn on d6? You will notice that this is the mirror image of the position that we get in the Mikenas defense. So this is not like a dubious opening that should not be played at all. No, and it is in this position after the move pawn to f4 where I recommend that you completely give up your free knight on e5. Oh, wait a second. But this looks like white can just take our free knight on e5. Well, that doesn't work due to queen h4 check, and right here, believe it or not, the ball is in our hands. It is nearly impossible for black to lose if he knows exactly what he is doing, trust me or not. The first variation that we're going to look at is the g3 variation, when white decides to block the check with his pawn. Here you already know the famous trap which I showed you in this video, which has popped above. Queen takes e5 check, and also eyeballing the free rook on h1. If queen e2 blocking the check, we just simply take the free rook on h1. We just got back our piece, and now we are up an exchange. And so white plays knight f3 in an effort to trap the queen, but we don't have to worry because we have pawn to b6, which is the key move in this line. For example, if king d2, please note that white is just one move away from trapping our queen after bishop g2, which is why we have this bishop here. We just simply play bishop s6, attacking white's queen, and also the bishop on f1. And so white has no option but to take on s6, after which we take the poor knight. Knight c3 is the most played move, just developing the knight. Bishop b4 pinning the knight, and also intending to go pawn to d4 next. Pawn to a3, a desperado move, because there's nothing that white can really do anyway. So we take the knight, and after pawn takes, we simply play knight e7 with ideas of putting our knight on g6 later on. And here position is about -8 in favor of black, which is automatically winning. Anyways, this was in the g3 line. Let's look at another variation. Now seriously, don't just watch this video. Please consider subscribing to my channel, because that encourages me to keep on making more wonderful videos just like this one. And by hitting the like button, which you don't do most of the times, you are simply saying thank you, Kaspa, and that encourages a lot. And don't feel lazy to leave your comments in the comment section down below so that I can learn of your existence. And believe you me, I take time to read all the comments, and I do respond to the important ones. And again, before I forget, remember to check the link for my new website in the description down below, where you can purchase my courses at very affordable prices. Anyways, let's get back into the video. Now let me introduce you to the draw variation, where white can't even do anything. After pawn to d4, we still play knight c6, d5, knight e5, pawn to e4, we play e6, paving way for our dark squared bishop, pawn to f4, again the top laid move, again we sacrifice our knight for free, and black takes. It is in this position where I said simply play queen h4 check. So in the previous line we looked at pawn to g3 blocking the check. Now here white doesn't want to lose the rook, and so he plays king e2. Now wait a second, this is the line that you can play against really strong players, and I can guarantee you that you can force a draw from here, especially if you just need one, or maybe if you just want to grab some elos, or maybe just simply making a name that you drew against a titled player or a really strong player. Please consider playing this line, as there is nothing that white can do. After queen h5 check, and from here it will just be perpetual checks unless white wants to lose. For example, if white blocks with the knight, we take on e4 with our pawn, and on the next move we'll take white's knight. From there we'll definitely go on to win the game, and so you see them playing king d2, after which you play queen h6. So what are we doing here? Remember, our queen will just be moving along this file, the h file. We don't want to move it to the g file, no, because that won't be a draw. So we'll just be playing in these squares that I have highlighted. So 3 squares along the h file and 3 squares in the 6th rank. Watch. King c3 by white. We play queen c6 check, king b3, queen b6 check, king c3. Again, we're just doing the same things. Now here I want you to memorize this position. When white's king is on c3 while our queen is on b6, this is where the outcome of the game is decided. And let me say that again. The outcome of the game is decided from the next move that black is going to play in this exact position. So queen b4 check leads to the 8 pawns variation, where you will remain with 8 pawns and your opponent will remain with 5 pawns. So there we are talking of having 3 pawns for a knight. Bishop b4 check leads to a win variation. I am going to show you that. And by win variation, what I mean is you will have a very decent advantage as black, which will be enough to win the game. Anyways, but queen c6, which we are looking at in this particular variation, leads to a draw. Hence, I call this the draw variation. So here, remember, we are playing against a really strong titled player or an advanced player, and we just want to have a draw, go home and chill with our families. So queen c6, we just want to have a draw. White plays king d2. Again, we go back to h6 check. King d3 may be played by white. And what do we do here? Queen h6 check, king d2, again queen h6 check. This will just be a repetition of moves. King e1, there's nothing that white can do. Queen h4, king e2, queen h5 check. We're just playing the same stuffs, or we're going to be giving white a perpetual checks. But in this position, let's say if white gets tired and plays something like king d3 here, well, we'll just grab a free queen and white should resign. Anyway, so that was the draw variation. Let's move on. Now let's look at the win variation. So this is where white begins with pawn to d4, knight c6, pawn to d5, knight e5 again, e4, and here we play pawn to e6, and then f4. Again, we sacrifice the knight. So white takes the knight, then queen h4. So we just looked at how to continue if all we want is a draw, but you can also play for a win by doing the same stuffs first. Let's say king e2 by white, you play queen h5, king d2, queen h6. So white plays king c3, here we go queen c6 check, king b3, we go queen b6 check. Now we are about to get the position that I asked you guys to memorize. Once our queen is on b6 and white's king goes to c3, what did I say? The outcome of the game is decided from the next move by black in this exact position. We just looked at queen to c6, which leads to a draw variation, and I said queen b4 check leads to the 8 pawns variation, but bishop b4, which we are looking at in this variation, leads to a win variation, because already the position is about negative 2.7 in favor of black. Suffice to win the game with perfect play from here. So we just simply go bishop b4 check, so white only has king d3, after which we take on e4 with our pawn, and again all these squares are covered by our pieces, so white can only play king e2 or taking on e4, If they take on e4, which they do most of the times, here we just play this move that I want you guys to memorize, Queen f2, simply limiting the movements of the white king. So it's like the king is now in a box. And here our plans are very simple. Just to play e5, check, and bishop f5 in the near future. Pawn to c6 will also come. So the game is almost over in this position. For example, if white does nothing, let's just say a useless move, pawn to a3. Here we just play pawn to d5, and that's check. And if e takes d6 with n%, we play bishop b5 check. Please note that all these squares are covered by our pieces. So white plays king e5, and then here we play pawn to f6, king d5 the only move, and queen c5 checkmate. So this is how deadly this defense is. Anyways, let's go back a few moves. Right in this position, after queen f2, limiting the movement of the king, white may play knight f3 here. Again, you just play pawn to d5 check. If white takes with n%, knight f6 check, king d3, bishop f5 check, king c4, bishop e6 check, king takes b4. I mean, that bishop was hanging. Yes, but we have knight d5 check, and the only sensible move that white can play is to give up his queen. Otherwise, if king f4, for example, there's a mate in 2 after queen c5, intending to checkmate on b4, and if something like pawn to a3 avoiding the checkmate, we have knight b6 checkmate. And that's what happens after queen f2 and knight f3. So here we just played pawn to d5 check. Even if white doesn't take with n%, it doesn't matter even if they take with the king, because right now we're going to play bishop e6 check, and the only move is for white to play king e4, and then we play pawn to f5 check, king f4, pawn to h6. There's a mate in 1 coming because the knight is pinned to the king by our queen. So h4 by white, g5 anyways, and that's check. H takes g5, h takes g5 check, king takes g5, and queen g3 checkmate. Anyway, so that was just some important lines to know in the win variation. Now we can look at the 8 pawns variation. Now this happens after pawn to d4, knight c6, d5, knight e5, pawn to e4, and here we play pawn to e6, and then f4. Again, we sacrifice the knight. So white takes the knight, then queen h4. Let's say king e2 by white. You play queen h5, king d2, queen h6. So white plays king c3. Here we go queen c6 check, king b3, king c3, and now we are back to the position where the game is decided by what we play next. So we looked at the bishop b4 check, which is the win variation. I'm just using that for lack of better terms. Queen c6 is the draw variation. Now if we want to remain with 8 pawns, we just go queen b4 check, king d3 only move. Now here we simply take on e4 with a pawn, and after king e2 we play queen b5 check, because next we want to grab another pawn. That's the whole purpose of giving a check. So king e1, and then we take the pawn right away. And as you can see in this position, we now have 8 pawns and white has 5 pawns. 3 pawns equals to 1 minor piece, precisely a knight in this position. By the way, position is equal. If there's someone who has an advantage here, technically speaking, it's black. You can check that with Stockfish. So for example, if knight c3, intending to go knight d5 or knight b5 next, we just play pawn to c6, stopping those ideas. And honestly speaking, it's very difficult to choose the best continuation for white here, because all of his pieces are doing nothing at the back and they have no better squares to go to. For example, we want to have a chain of pawns from the queen side. Let me show you. Bishop c4, we play pawn to d5, and now you can see this pawn chain. And this is the only chain that you should think of, okay? You may be tempted to start creating a pyramid by playing pawn to f5 and pawn to g6. This doesn't seem to work well for black. So in the meantime, just think of building a pawn chain from the queen side. Forget about the king side at the moment. On the king side, we're just going to be developing our minor pieces actively. So at the moment, don't think of playing pawn to f5. We don't want to have many dark square weaknesses. our king needs to have a place to hide at some point. Anyways, the bishop is under attack. Bishop b3, d4. Again, it's all about the pawns, the expansion of pawns. Knight c e2, double attack on our d4 pawn. We defend it with our bishop plus developing our bishop. Bishop f4 is played by white attacking our queen. Now we do not leave our d4 pawn, which is attacked by two of white's pieces, so we just play queen f6, still protecting our d4 pawn, queen d2. Now I should mention to say that white's king cannot castle long, no short, because remember that it moved many times in the opening when we were giving some perpetual checks. So pawn to f5, planning to go f4 next, and pawn to b5, trapping white's bishop. So pawn to a3, creating a square for the bishop, a4, bishop a2, and then we play knight e7. So this knight normally develops on g6, then we castle short. Anyways, let's go back. So back to this position where we have 8 pawns against 5. Now we look at what to do after knight e2 by white instead of knight c3. Well, here we still continue with our normal development. We first of all make our simple pawn chain on the queen side, and now you can see we have a similar position like the one we had last time, except that the light squared bishop is not on c4 this time. So bishop f4 attacking our queen again, queen f6, queen d4 may be played, forcing an exchange. Well, whenever you see an exchange in this line, just go for it and simplify the game, because at the end of the day, material is equal and the position is equal, even if you check on Stockfish. And again, here we don't even have to rush. We have plenty of things to play. Bishop b4 pinning the knight, and in most cases we do not develop our knight to f6, we develop it to e7 under normal circumstances. Let me show you. Bishop e2 by white, we play knight g6, and from here, trust me, with perfect play, there is no way white can win this game. Just like I said, 3 pawns equals 1 knight in this particular position, and we'll be good to go. Anyway, so that was just in the 8 pawns variation. Of course, this is not the variation for every chess player. It calls for highly skilled chess players who are able to play with pawns. Hey there, do you still find the queen's pawn opening to be quite challenging? I mean, after white plays pawn to d4 on the first move? Well, if yes, then all I'm asking from you in the next few minutes is nothing but your ears and, well, your eyeballs as well. Because I'm gonna show you a very interesting response that you can try out against d4, not just in blitz. I'm talking about the knight c6 response, which is called the Mikenas defense. And yes, I made a video about this defense a few months ago, but today's video is gonna be a little bit different from the first one that you watched, you guys. So I'm gonna go through this system very quickly. As you can see here, our main goal is to play pawn to e5, could be on the second move or maybe later in the middle game stage. So white's most played move in this position is knight to f3, then followed by c4, the second most played move, and d5, the third most played move. But I'm also going to cover the e3 line by white. So first, let's start with d5, which I covered in my last video on the Mikenas defense. So I'm not going to go into detail. You can watch that video after you finish watching this. Here you simply play knight e5. After pawn to e4, I recommend you go d6. And here you are going to see f4. White has overextended his pawns, okay? So you don't have to be scared of this. This is just a mirror of the Alehein's defense. After pawn to f4, I recommended taking on d5 with your e-pawn. Wait a second, that hangs our knight on e5, right? But believe it or not, in this position, the game can only be decided by black. It is nearly impossible for black to lose in this position. How can you claim a draw with this line? Well, you're only going to be moving your queen in these second squares. I mean, 3 squares along the h-file and 3 squares along the 6th rank. Alright, so white plays d4, and there you go knight c6, my recommendation, and then they play d5, and you still go knight e5. Now, it's not every time you're going to see white playing pawn to e4 here. They might play pawn to f4, which is the second most played move. What do I recommend here? Well, you don't resign. I recommend you go knight g6, This is more like the Alehein's defense. Pawn to f5 will allow us to put our knight back on e5 and play pawn to d6. That'll be very awesome for us, you guys. But what you're going to see most of your opponents playing here is pawn to e4. Well, after which I recommend you play this move immediately. Watch. Pawn to e5. And hey, note that we are attacking the f5 pawn twice. So what you're going to see most of your opponents playing in this position is f5. Which is a long-term positional mistake and maybe a blunder because you have queen h4 check once again. And if they play pawn to g3, well, you have this move, queen takes e4 check, which also attacks the undefended rook on h1. And obviously, white cannot block this check with his elbow, but they have to do it with their queen or their bishop or their knight, I don't know. After which you can safely capture the free rook on h1. And now you will see them playing knight to f3, wanting to trap your queen on h1 because it can't move at the moment, you can see. So what do I recommend here? You simply go knight 6 e7. Because your knight was under attack, right? And here if they play king d2 with an intention of playing bishop g2 next to trap your queen or to kill it, well, I recommend you play this move. Watch. Pawn to e4, attacking your opponent's knight. Because now if they play bishop g2, you don't even have to take the knight, but just give them a check on e3. And if king takes, you would take the bishop on c1 and life will be good. But if queen takes, you take the bishop on g2 with check and your queen is saved. So this is to show you that it is nearly impossible for white to trap your queen. Your queen is very safe. I mean, even if they play something else here, instead of king d2, let's say knight c3, stopping our pawn push to e4, the move I recommend here is pawn to b6, which opens up the way for your light squad bishop. E.g., if they play bishop e3 here, you can safely play this move, bishop s6, attacking their queen. Note that your bishop is undefended, but the idea is that if they take your free bishop, that's when you can rescue your queen by taking on f3, and I don't see an immediate way for black to lose this game. So this is just how safe this line is, even if they play knight c3. I mean, instead of bishop e3, if white plays knight takes e5 in an effort to stop bishop s6 this time, because that would just be a free bishop for real, well, I recommend you just play bishop b7 here. So they'll play bishop g5 here. By the way, with knight takes e5, now you have queen takes h2 if bishop g2, okay? So I just wanted to show you guys that there's absolutely no way for white to trap your queen, and all these lines that I'm showing you guys only improve black's position, okay? So next we are ready to castle long. Anyways, let's look at what people play against the Mikenas defense. Well, back to this position. After d5, knight e5, pawn to f4, then you go knight g6, e4, and e5. You might not see people playing pawn to f5 here, where you play queen h4 check. I mean, white can also take with n% after pawn to e5. So they may play d takes e6, and here Stockfish thinks d takes e6 is a more mature and top class move, but hey, that's only in the eyeballs of Stockfish. So if you want to keep the queens on the board, you can simply play f takes e6, which is what I recommend at human level, because you're not going to be playing Stockfish. After knight to f3, you can simply play bishop c5, they'll go knight c3, you go d6, I mean, queen e2. These are all possibilities. They want to castle long, because they can't castle short due to our bishop on c5. So knight f6, just normal development, bishop d2, castle short, castle long. I mean, this is what people play, which is not even bad for black. It's just positional chess. You just need to know how to play your cards until you get a good position. So that's one of the ways in which your game can go with the Mikenas defense, and I would love to be black, honestly speaking, in this position. So how about if we look at something even more practical? Let's see. But before I do that, the best you guys can do to encourage me to keep on making more wonderful videos just like this one is to subscribe to my channel if at all you haven't already, and give this video a thumbs up if at all you like this already. And you can do that in about 4 seconds during this short break. So let's do the needful and don't go away. Alright, so back to our starting position. Our main goal, remember, is to push pawn to e5 anytime soon. The top played move here is not pawn to d5, which we just finished looking at. But knight to f3. This is what you guys are going to see very often, but what is our plan here? Listen. The simple plan is to get rid of our light squared bishop by exchanging it with the knight on f3. So keep this in mind. We just want to have a simple game, and here is how you're going to achieve that plan. So after knight to f3, simply go d6. The beauty of d6 is that at least we are assured that white will never play knight to e5, which they like doing in the queen's pawn game. c4 is the top played move here, after which you simply go bishop g4. You already know the plan. They'll play e3 or knight c3. It doesn't matter, but the idea is to get rid of that knight as quickly as you can, misplacing white's queen by making it sit on f3, after which you go pawn to e5. You see the plan that I was talking about. Get rid of your bishop and play pawn to e5. That'll be a simple game from now on, you guys. And here you are going to see them play pawn to d5, which we want to see. Now write this down. The moment you see pawn to d5, just think of putting all your pawns on dark squares, and I'm going to show you the perfect example of this. Now in this position, we don't want to play knight e7. Why? Because we still have our dark squared bishop on f8, which will be unhappy, and that's why I recommend the move knight b8 here. I mean, knight e7 only makes sense if our dark squared bishop is already out of the pawn chain. So just keep that in mind. That's why we play knight b8 in this position. Our queen's knight will later on sit on c5, but that will be after we play the move pawn to f5 to stop pawn to b4, which would attack our knight on c5. So keep that in mind, you guys. Anyways, so they'll play knight c3, and wait a second. See how we haven't developed any of our big pieces? So what is our plan here? Watch. Our main goal is to put all our pawns on dark squares. And that's because our dark squared bishop is not in the game. So our pawns will take up the role of our dark squared bishop to control all the dark squares. So start with the pawns first. f5. This also prepares for knight c5 in the near future by stopping pawn to b4 like I said. So they'll play e4 here. You go b6. You can see how nicely all our pawns are placed on dark squares. Bishop d3. Now we play h6, and this is the position that you want to achieve. Don't worry about the f-pawn. We'll use this for a possible pawn break in the middle game. So they'll castle short, and now you can clearly see our ideas. Put the knight on c5, develop the bishop on a7, wanting to trade off bishops since all of your pawns will be on dark squares, and the knight you castle short. This will be a very simple game. For example, bishop e7, bishop d2, they just connected their rooks. You go bishop g5 in an effort to trade off bishops, and after knight d7, wanting to sit on c5, they'll go knight b5, which they like doing. Just eyeballing the c7 pawn in case your queen moves away. So you need to be very careful though. You go knight c5, attacking the bishop, bishop c2, and then play knight f6. Castling can wait in most of these positions. They'll play pawn to f4. What do you do against pawn to f4? Well, the simplest you can do is to take that pawn and continue with life. But another move that you can also consider is knight d7, so that if pawn to f5, you can put your knight back on f6. And that will be bad for white. So if they take on a5, you take back with your knight. And here there is nothing that can chase your knight from this square. It's the most active piece on the board as we speak. Anyways, they'll play b3, protecting their c-pawn. So you just castle short. Rook f2. Now you play rook c8, protecting your c7 pawn. If knight a7, you play rook b8 and put your rook on b7 to defend your c7 pawn forever. Rook a f1, you go queen h4 since your pawn on c7 is still protected by your knight. And next you're going to do some magnesian stuffs here. Pawn to f6, rook f7, rook c f8. I mean, I still don't see a way for black to lose this game if played correctly. Anyways, let's look at something else. Alright, so we're still looking at the knight to f3 line where I recommended to get rid of your bishop. You still go d6, and after c4, you go bishop g4 and get rid of your light squared bishop as fast as you can. e5 once again, but this time you might not see pawn to d5, which allows you to play knight b8 and start putting all your pawns on dark squares, remember? Instead of pawn to d5, they may also play d takes e5 here, but just take back that pawn and continue playing chess. And oh, before I forget, you can write this down. Bishop b4 is only good when the white queen is still sitting on d1. The problem with bishop b4 here is that it would just help white to develop his queenside pieces very fast and castle long. For example, bishop b4, bishop d2, castle long. That's why we don't play bishop b4 when the white queen is already out, okay? So I recommend you just develop normally, and then they'll play bishop e2, and this would just be a normal game of chess, you guys. So by simply playing the Mikenas defense, you ended up making the right opening moves. In the near future, you push pawn to f5, e4, I mean, the position is just too good for black here. Anyways, let's look at another line. So the other move that you may see after d4, knight c6 is an immediate pawn to c4 by white. What do? This is a great time to play pawn to e5, you guys. Inviting white to play d5, which you want, okay? This is our main motivation in the Mikenas defense. Our plan is very simple: to trade off our dark squared bishop and put all our pawns on dark squares and let the game of chess play itself. Let me show you. Bishop b4 check, whatever white does here, for example knight c3, which they normally do, just trade off your dark squared bishop, doubling up white's pawns along the c file and play knight c e7. Knight c e7 here is okay because we don't have a bishop on f1. So they'll play e4. This is what they do. You go d6. Now you can see how you are beginning to put all your pawns on dark squares since you don't have a dark squared bishop. So they'll play bishop d3. You go b6. If bishop g5, you can go h6. You chase that bishop and play knight g6. So they'll play knight f3 here, or knight a2, I don't know. Then you go knight f6. They castle short. You do the same. Bishop g5, oops, if you play h6, they'll mess up your pawn structure on the king side. So you better go knight g6 first. And after f4, you simply meet f4 with f5. See how all your pieces are beautifully sitting on dark squares. If they play h3, you have h6, and now all of our pawns are on dark squares. This is our main goal in the Mikenas defense when white plays pawn to d5. Here white plays bishop e3. And position is already -1 in favor of black. By the way, there's a little trap in this line that you need to master. You go knight h5. The plan is just to plant your knight on f5 forever. That'll be your juicy square for this knight. And if they think they can win a free pawn on e5, you go knight takes e4. And after queen takes h5, the bishop on d3 will be hanging. So here you're just up a piece and there's little that white can do to stop you from winning. This is just how interesting your game can be. And that was all in the d5 line after we played pawn to e5 on move 2. So we just played pawn to e5, but this time you might not see white playing pawn to d5. They may also consider taking on e5 with their d pawn. Well, here just take back that pawn, and I was surprised to find out that knight c3 is actually the top played move by white, after which you just go on to take that free pawn on c4. Anyways, but that's latest for you. So they won't play knight c3 under normal circumstances. They have to play something like e3, and here you can write this down. Our simple plan is to always keep our knight on the center. We'll leave this knight where it is if white doesn't bother to chase it away. In fact, we would love to trade it off with any of white's pieces and recapture with our d pawn. Let me show you. Here we can just continue with bishop b4. We want to simplify the game. And after knight takes d2, we go knight f6. Just leave your knight on e5 like this for good. So they'll play knight gf3. You go d6. If they take your knight, that'll be well and good. Bishop e2. Queen e7, castle short, queen c2, you go g6. Maybe one day you may put your bishop on f5 or fianchetto hit on the queen side after something like rook f1, and then you play bishop b7. Knight takes e5. So you see what I was talking about. This is when you take back with your d pawn and your position is excellent. Next you are ready to play pawn to c5 and rook a d8. So this would just be awesome for you. Anyways, Now let's look at the last possible line that white can try out here. After d4 and knight c6, let's say they go pawn to e3. Well, once again, just think of getting rid of your light squared bishop as fast as you can and start putting all your pawns on dark squares. So you go d6, and trust me, they'll still play knight f3, after which you should play bishop g4. You already know the idea, but hey, don't rush. Play wisely here. Knight to f6, just play normal chess. h3, that's when you take now, because if they take back, you have plenty of options to take. If you want, you can play this in the King's Indian defense style with g6, bishop g7 and castle shot. But hey, keeping everything in the spirit of the Mikenas defense, just go e5, and trust me, even in this position, black is still fine, because this is just too simplified for black and almost approaching the end game. Position is about plus 0.7, which is normal. I mean, even if they play castle short, you still have a normal game and a lead in development. I don't see a way for black to complain in this position. So take my advice and you will thank me later. Anyways, so this is all for today, you guys. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, you already know what to do. Until next time.